The rain poured heavily on the city streets that night, creating a misty haze under the flickering streetlights. Outside Central Hospital, a man in blue scrubs stood patiently under his umbrella, his shoulders tired from a grueling 12-hour shift in the operating room. As a cardiac surgeon, he had just finished saving 2 lives that day, but right now, all he wanted was to get home and rest. He raised his hand again and again, watching as taxi after taxi drove past him. Some slowed down, saw him, and then mysteriously sped up again. The surgeon sighed, used to this treatment, but still feeling the familiar ache in his chest each time it happened. His brown skin shouldn't matter, he thought, but somehow it always did. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity in the rain, a yellow taxi pulled up. The driver, an older man with graying hair and weathered features, hesitated before hitting the unlock button. The sound of the locks clicking open felt reluctant, almost forced. The surgeon could see the driver watching him through the rearview mirror, eyes narrow with suspicion. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice carrying an edge that the surgeon had heard too many times before. The doctor gave his address, a well-known upscale neighborhood about 20 minutes away. The driver's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He turned around in his seat, looking the surgeon up and down, taking in his soaped scrubs and tired appearance. "You sure that's where you're headed?" he asked, emphasis on the "you're" making it clear what he meant. The surgeon nodded calmly, though inside he felt a mix of frustration and sadness. Here he was, fresh from saving lives, and yet to this driver, he was nothing but a stereotype. He settled into the back seat, the leather squeaking beneath his damp clothes. As they pulled away from the hospital, the driver kept glancing in his rearview mirror, as if expecting trouble. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night talk show discussing city politics. The surgeon closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about his patients from today, the young mother with the heart defect, the elderly man who needed emergency bypass surgery. In the operating room, it never mattered what anyone looked like. All that mattered was saving lives. The driver cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You know," he started, his tone carrying what he probably thought was casual conversation but dripped with prejudice, "this neighborhood you're heading to. It's pretty expensive. You sure you can handle the fare?" The surgeon opened his eyes, catching the driver's gaze in the mirror. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before, the assumptions, the subtle and not so subtle jabs. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion from his long shift, or maybe it was the weight of knowing that just hours ago, he had held human hearts in his hands, literally fixing them, while this man's heart seemed so full of misplaced judgment. Little did the driver know that his own life was about to change dramatically, and the man he was looking at with such disdain would soon become the most important person in his world. The surgeon noticed something else too, something his trained medical eye couldn't miss. Every few minutes, the driver would rub his chest, just slightly, probably not even aware he was doing it. His breathing seemed a bit labored, and his neck showed the slight pulsing of elevated blood pressure. The night was far from over, and this taxi ride was about to become much more than just another example of everyday prejudice. The real story was just beginning, and life was about to teach this driver a lesson he would never forget. The taxi wound through the city streets, wipers fighting against the heavy rain. Inside, the tension grew thicker with every mile. The driver seemed unable to help himself, making one offensive comment after another, each one barely disguised as casual conversation. "You know," he said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, "I've been driving this taxi for 20 years. I can usually tell exactly where my passengers belong. You just don't look like someone who lives in that neighborhood." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in his laugh. The surgeon remained quiet, watching raindrops race down the window. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably another message from his daughter, asking when he'd be home to help with her science project. He thought about how he taught her to handle difficult people with grace and dignity, just as his own parents had taught him. "Must be some kind of mistake," the driver continued, shaking his head. Maybe you're the gardener? Or security guard? He looked in the rearview mirror again, his eyes challenging. Those big houses up there, they're for, well, a different kind of people. The surgeon took a deep breath. In the operating room earlier that day, he had performed a complex bypass surgery on a patient others had deemed too risky. His hands had been steady, his mind focused. He carried that same composure now, even as the driver's words tried to strip away his dignity. Actually, the surgeon started to say, but stopped when he noticed something concerning. The driver's face had become increasingly pale, and he was sweating despite the cool air conditioning. His breathing had become more labored, and his left hand kept rising to his chest, clutching at his shirt. The driver didn't seem to notice his own symptoms as he launched into another inappropriate story. Last week, I had someone like you try to run off without paying. Had to chase him down. That's why I'm being careful now, you understand. Can't be too careful these days. His words trailed off as he grimaced in pain. The surgeon leaned forward, his professional instincts kicking in. Sir, are you feeling all right? He asked, noting how the driver's right arm was now trembling slightly. I'm fine, the driver snapped, but his voice was weaker now. Just a bit of heartburn. Had some spicy food earlier. He tried to wave it off, but the surgeon could see his condition deteriorating rapidly. The rain had gotten worse, and they were now on a quieter street. The driver's breathing became more erratic, and his words started to slur. Maybe I should pull over for a minute. He managed to say, his face now ashen. Yes, pull over right now, the surgeon said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making life or death decisions. The taxi swerved slightly as the driver struggled to control it, finally managing to stop at the curb. I don't feel so good, the driver admitted, his previous bravado completely gone. His hands were shaking as he tried to put the car in park. The surgeon was already pulling out his phone, his mind racing through the symptoms he observed. Chest pain, shortness of breath, sweating, weakness in the arms. The driver turned around, perhaps to make another comment, but instead, his eyes widened in panic. I can't breathe properly, he gasped. The surgeon could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear he'd seen in countless patients when they realized something was seriously wrong. In that moment, all the driver's previous comments and prejudices became meaningless. The only thing that mattered was that a human being needed help, and the surgeon was ready to provide it. The night was about to take an unexpected turn, and the driver had no idea that the man he had been mocking would soon become his only hope for survival. The taxi sat idle by the curb, hazard lights blinking in the rain. Inside, the situation had completely transformed. The driver was now slumped over the steering wheel, his face twisted in pain, while the surgeon quickly moved to action. Without hesitation, he got out of the back seat and opened the driver's door, the rain soaking his scrubs once again. Sir, I need you to look at me, the surgeon said firmly but gently. I'm a cardiac surgeon from Central Hospital, and I believe you're having a heart attack. The driver's eyes widened at this revelation, a mix of disbelief and shame crossing his pain-stricken face. The surgeon was already dialing emergency services with one hand while checking the driver's pulse with the other. Yes, we need an ambulance immediately, he spoke into the phone, his voice clear and professional. Male patient, approximately 60 years old, showing clear signs of cardiac distress. While waiting for the ambulance, the surgeon helped the driver into a more comfortable position. Try to take slow, steady breaths, he instructed, his trained hands quickly loosening the driver's tight collar and seatbelt. The driver tried to speak, perhaps to apologize for his earlier behavior, but the surgeon gently shushed him. Don't speak unless necessary. Save your energy. Rain continued to pour around them as the surgeon worked, his movements precise and practiced. He pulled out the small medical kit he always carried in his bag, a habit from years of being a doctor. The driver watched in stunned silence as the same hands he'd been suspicious of just minutes ago now worked to help save his life. The pain. It's getting worse, the driver managed to gasp out. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. The surgeon nodded, understanding the fear in the man's voice. He'd heard that fear countless times before, but this time felt different. This time, the person in need was someone who, just moments ago, had treated him with such disdain. Listen carefully, the surgeon said, maintaining eye contact with the driver. The ambulance is on its way. I'm going to give you an aspirin from my kit. It will help thin your blood. I'm right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. The driver nodded weakly, tears forming in his eyes. In the distance, sirens began to wail. The surgeon continued his assessment, his mind already planning the next steps. He knew the closest hospital was 10 minutes away, and from the symptoms he was seeing, time was crucial. The driver would likely need immediate surgery. I'm sorry, the driver suddenly whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The things I said, the way I treated you. He struggled to continue, but the surgeon softly interrupted him. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you the help you need, the surgeon replied, his voice kind but firm. We can talk about everything else later. He could see the shame and regret in the driver's eyes, but there would be time for that conversation later if they acted quickly enough. The ambulance lights finally appeared at the end of the street, casting red and blue reflections in the puddles of rain. The surgeon began gathering the information the paramedics would need. The driver's apparent age, when the symptoms started, his observations of the progression. Years of medical training kicked in, pushing aside any personal feelings about their earlier interaction. As the ambulance pulled up, the surgeon knew this night was far from over. The driver would need emergency surgery, and as fate would have it, he was the on-call cardiac surgeon for emergency cases that night. The man who had judged him so harshly would soon be trusting him with his life. The paramedics jumped out of the ambulance, rushing toward them with their equipment. The surgeon stood up, ready to brief them on the situation, rain still pouring down on all of them. This was just the beginning of what would become a long night. A night that would change both their lives forever. The emergency room burst into action as the paramedics wheeled the taxi driver through the doors. The surgeon walked alongside, giving rapid-fire instructions to the medical team. Patient showing signs of severe cardiac distress. Need immediate ECG and blood work. Time is critical. The same hospital he'd left just an hour ago now felt completely different. Earlier, he'd been the tired doctor heading home. Now he was charged with adrenaline, focused entirely on saving the life of someone who had shown him nothing but prejudice. Doctor, one of the nurses called out, "We've got a room ready." She paused, looking confused. Weren't you just leaving for the night? The surgeon nodded but didn't break his stride as they rushed the driver into the treatment room. The driver's eyes were wide with fear as the medical team swarmed around him, attaching monitors and starting IVs. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, its rhythm irregular and concerning. The surgeon noticed how the driver kept looking at him, perhaps still processing the incredible turn of events. Your blood pressure is dangerously high, the surgeon explained calmly, studying the ECG readings. The ECG shows significant blockage in your coronary arteries. You're going to need emergency surgery. He spoke with the same professional compassion he showed all his patients, despite their earlier interaction. The driver's face crumpled. Surgery? He whispered, his voice trembling. But how can I trust? He couldn't finish the sentence, shame coloring his pale face. The same prejudices that had led him to judge the surgeon earlier now made him fear putting his life in those same hands. The surgeon leaned closer, his voice firm but gentle. Right now, you're having a major heart attack. Without immediate surgery, your chances aren't good. I'm the best chance you have. He paused, letting the words sink in. I took an oath to save lives, all lives, and that's exactly what I intend to do. A tear rolled down the driver's cheek as he nodded slowly. The surgeon could see the mental struggle playing out on his face, the battle between his deep-seated prejudices and the desperate need to trust the very person he had discriminated against. The medical team worked quickly, prepping the driver for emergency surgery. The surgeon stepped out briefly to change into his operating scrubs, his mind already running through the procedure he would need to perform. As he washed his hands, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The tired doctor from earlier was gone, replaced by the focused professional he became in critical moments. When he returned to the room, the driver reached out weakly and caught his arm. "Doctor," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I've been such a fool. All my life, I've judged people without—" He had to pause, fighting for breath. "Without knowing them. And now, the person I judged might be the only one who can save me." The surgeon patted his hand gently. "We can talk about all of that later. Right now, I need you to focus on staying calm. My team and I are going to take good care of you." The words were simple, but carried the weight of years of experience and professional dedication. As they prepared to move the driver to the operating room, the surgeon noticed the man's wallet and phone on the side table. "Is there anyone we should call for you?" he asked. The driver shook his head slowly. "No family," he replied quietly. "I pushed them all away with my attitudes." Another tear slid down his face. "Maybe this is life teaching me a lesson." The surgeon checked the final preparations, then nodded to his team. As they began wheeling the driver toward the operating room, he couldn't help but think about how life sometimes created the most powerful teaching moments. In just a few hours, this man had gone from making prejudiced jokes to putting his life literally in the hands of someone he had discriminated against. The operating room lights beckoned ahead, and the surgeon knew that what happened next would change both their lives forever. The real test was about to begin. The operating room hummed with focused energy as the team prepared for surgery. The bright lights cast everything in stark clarity, from the gleaming instruments to the determined faces behind surgical masks. The surgeon stood at the washing station, methodically scrubbing his hands and arms, his mind clear and focused despite the late hour. A nurse helped him into his surgical gown and gloves as he thought out the irony of the situation. Just hours ago, this patient had questioned whether he belonged in an upscale neighborhood. Now he was trusting this same outsider with his life. The surgeon pushed these thoughts aside. In the operating room, personal feelings had no place. "Patient's BP is climbing," announced the anesthesiologist as they wheeled the driver in. The surgeon nodded, approaching the operating table. The driver's eyes found his, filled with a mix of fear and something else. Perhaps regret, perhaps hope. "We're going to take good care of you," the surgeon assured him, his voice steady and professional. "When you wake up, you'll be on your way to recovery." These were words he'd said countless times before, but tonight they carried extra weight. As the anesthesiologist began administering the medication, the driver struggled to speak through his oxygen mask. "Doctor, if I don't make it." His voice was weak, trembling. The surgeon leaned closer. "Say your strength. You can tell me everything after the surgery." He gave a reassuring nod, watching as the medications took effect and the driver's eyes slowly closed. "Scalpel," the surgeon called out, holding out his hand. The familiar weight of the instrument centered him. This was his element, where nothing mattered except the life beneath his hands. The operating room fell into its usual rhythm. The steady beep of monitors, the precise movements of instruments, the focused breathing of the surgical team. The procedure was complex. Multiple blockages needed attention, and time was crucial. The surgeon worked with practiced precision, his hands steady as they navigated delicate vessels. Every movement was calculated, every decision made with years of experience behind it. "BP dropping," the anesthesiologist warned at one point. The surgeon didn't pause, his hands continuing their intricate work. He'd faced countless critical moments like this before. The team moved in perfect coordination, responding to his quiet commands. Hours passed in what seemed like minutes. Outside the operating room windows, the night sky began showing hints of dawn. The surgeon remained focused, his world narrowed to the task at hand. Each suture, each graft had to be perfect. As he worked, he thought about how life had brought them to this moment. The driver's earlier words about judgments and prejudice echoed in his mind. Here, under his hands, was proof that beneath all our superficial differences, we're all the same, vulnerable, human, in need of care and compassion. Final bypass graft is holding well, he announced, checking the blood flow. The team's tension eased slightly. They'd crossed the most dangerous part of the journey. Now came the equally crucial task of closing up and ensuring everything would heal properly. The surgeon stepped back slightly, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. He'd been standing in the same position for hours, but his focus hadn't wavered. Looking at the monitors, he could see the driver's heart beating stronger now, more regularly. It was a good sign. As he began the final stages of the operation, he thought about what would happen when the driver woke up. Would this experience change him? Would he see the world, and people, differently? The surgeon had seen many transformations in his career, not just physical ones. Beginning to close now, he announced to his team. The nurse began counting instruments, following the strict protocols. Everything had to be perfect, every detail checked and double-checked. Lives depended on their thoroughness. Dawn was breaking outside as they finished the final sutures. The surgeon checked everything one last time before stepping back. "Good work, everyone," he said quietly. The team began their post-operation procedures, preparing to move the patient to recovery. Looking down at his patient, now stable and heading toward recovery, the surgeon felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. But this time, there was something more. A hope that perhaps this night would change more than just one man's heart. In the recovery room, machines beeped steadily as morning light filtered through the blinds. The surgeon sat at the nurse's station, finishing his detailed operation notes. He'd been awake for over 24 hours now, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the recovering taxi driver. A young nurse approached with a cup of coffee. "That was amazing work in there, doctor," she said softly, placing the cup next to him. "The way you handled those complications. I've never seen anything like it." The surgeon smiled tiredly, grateful for both the coffee and the kind words. Just then, the driver began to stir. The surgeon walked over, checking the monitors as he approached. The numbers looked good. Blood pressure stable, heart rhythm strong, and regular. It was always a crucial moment when patients first woke up after major heart surgery. The driver's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his face as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His hand moved weakly toward the breathing tube, but the surgeon gently stopped him. "Try to stay calm," he said. "You're in recovery. The surgery went well." Recognition dawned in the driver's eyes as they focused on the surgeon's face. Tears began forming at the corners of his eyes, sliding slowly down his cheeks. The surgeon checked his vital signs again. Everything remained stable. After a few more minutes, they were able to remove the breathing tube. The driver coughed weakly, accepting small sips of water from a nurse. His eyes never left the surgeon's face, as if trying to memorize every detail of the person who had saved his life. "Why?" the driver finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "After everything I said, everything I did, why did you help me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The surgeon pulled up a chair and sat down. "Because that's who I am," he replied simply. "It's not about who you are or what you believe. It's about who I am and what I believe." He paused, checking the IV lines. "And I believe every life has value." The driver's face crumpled, decades of prejudice cracking under the weight of this simple truth. "I've been so wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "All my life, I've been so wrong. I judged people without knowing them, without giving them a chance. A monitor beeped, and the surgeon stood to adjust it. "Try not to get too emotional right now," he advised gently. "Your heart needs time to heal." But they both knew he wasn't just talking about the physical heart. "My daughter," the driver said suddenly. "She stopped talking to me 2 years ago. Said she couldn't stand my prejudiced views anymore." He swallowed hard. "She was right. She was right all along." The surgeon nodded, understanding. He'd seen many transformations in his career, bodies healed, lives saved. But sometimes the most profound changes happened in people's minds and hearts. "You've been given a second chance," he said quietly. "Not everyone gets that. What matters now is what you do with it." He checked the surgical site, pleased to see everything looking as it should. A ray of sunlight broke through the blinds, falling across the hospital bed. The driver reached out weakly and caught the surgeon's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me a better way to live it." The surgeon squeezed his hand gently before letting go. "Get some rest," he advised. "The next few days will be important for your recovery." He turned to leave, his shift finally over, but the driver called out softly. "Doctor, would you help me call my daughter later?" The question was hesitant, hopeful. "I want to tell her she was right. I want to tell her I'm ready to change." The surgeon paused at the door, a small smile touching his lips. "Of course," he replied. "But first, you need to rest and heal." He watched as the driver nodded and closed his eyes, exhausted but peaceful. Walking out of the recovery room, the surgeon felt the weight of the long night lifting. Sometimes, he realized, healing came in many forms, and the most important surgeries fixed more than just the heart. Over the next few days, the hospital room became a space of healing, not just for the body, but for the mind and spirit too. The driver made steady progress, growing stronger each day. The surgeon visited regularly, checking his recovery and quietly observing the change happening within his patient. One afternoon, the surgeon walked in to find the driver sitting up in bed, holding his phone and looking anxious. "I talked to my daughter this morning," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She's coming to visit tomorrow. First time in 2 years. His hands shook slightly as he set the phone down. "That's excellent news," the surgeon replied, picking up the chart to check the latest readings. "Just remember to stay calm. Your heart is still healing." But he couldn't help smiling at the hope in his patient's eyes. "I told her everything," the driver continued, his voice soft with shame. "About that night in the taxi, about how I treated you, about the surgery." He paused, wiping his eyes. "She cried when I told her how you saved my life despite my behavior. Said it reminded her of why she always fought with me about my prejudices." The surgeon pulled up a chair, sensing his patient needed to talk. The medical monitors beeped steadily in the background as the driver gathered his thoughts. "You know, I've been thinking a lot these past few days," he said, looking out the window. "About all the people I've judged, all the hurt I've caused. Not just to strangers like you, but to my own family." His voice cracked slightly. "My wife left us when my daughter was young. Said she couldn't stand the hatred in my heart." A nurse came in to check vitals, but the driver continued after she left. "I used to blame everyone else for my problems. Different races, different cultures. They were all easy targets." He shook his head slowly. "But lying here, I've had time to think. The only person to blame was me." The surgeon listened quietly, noting how his patient's heart rate remained stable despite the emotional conversation. It was a good sign, both for his physical and emotional recovery. "Yesterday," the driver went on, "I asked the young man who delivers my lunch where he was from. Not to judge him, but to really know him. He told me about his family, his studies, his dreams." A tear rolled down his cheek. "He's working here to pay for medical school, just like you probably did once." The surgeon nodded, remembering his own journey. "Every person has a story," he said simply. "Often, It's not so different from our own. Just then, another doctor passed by the room, a doctor wearing a hijab. The driver waved at her, surprising the surgeon. Dr. Fatima, the driver explained. She checks on me every evening. Such a kind person. 2 weeks ago, I would have. He trailed off, ashamed. Well, I would have thought differently about her. The surgeon checked the surgical site as the driver continued talking. The incision was healing well, matching the healing that was happening within. My daughter, the driver said suddenly, she works with refugee children. That's what our biggest fight was about. I said horrible things about her work, about those children. He pressed his hands to his face. How could I have been so blind? They're just children, looking for safety, for a chance. The surgeon finished his examination and sat back down. It's never too late to open your eyes, he said gently. Or your heart. The driver lowered his hands, revealing eyes bright with tears, but also determination. When I get out of here, he said firmly, I want to do something meaningful. My daughter's refugee center, maybe they could use a volunteer driver. He looked at the surgeon hopefully. I know it's a small thing, but it's a start, right? The surgeon smiled warmly. Every journey begins with a single step, he replied. And it sounds like you're heading in the right direction. As the surgeon left the room that day, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, the most important healing happened not in the operating room, but in the quiet moments afterward, when hearts and minds opened to new possibilities. The next morning brought a moment the driver had been both longing for and dreading. His daughter stood in the doorway of his hospital room, clutching her purse tightly, uncertainty written across her face. The surgeon, who had just finished his morning rounds, watched from a distance as father and daughter saw each other for the first time in 2 years. Dad, she whispered, taking a tentative step forward. The driver reached out his arms, and suddenly she was running to him, all hesitation forgotten. They held each other tightly, both crying openly. The surgical team passing by pretended not to notice, giving them their privacy. I'm so sorry, the driver sobbed, holding his daughter close. I'm so sorry for everything. She pulled back slightly, wiping tears from her face as she looked at her father, really looked at him, for the first time since entering the room. You look different, Dad, she said softly. Something's changed in your eyes. She sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand. The driver glanced toward the surgeon, who was discreetly checking some charts nearby. That's the doctor I told you about on the phone, the driver said to his daughter. The one from the taxi, the one who saved my life. His daughter turned to look at the surgeon, her eyes filled with gratitude. The surgeon was about to leave them to their reunion when the driver called out. Doctor, please, could you stay for a moment? I want my daughter to hear this from both of us. As the surgeon pulled up a chair, the driver began telling his daughter about that rainy night. His voice shook as he described his behavior in the taxi, the hateful words he'd spoken, the prejudices he'd displayed. His daughter's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she didn't let go of his hand. And then, the driver continued, when I was having the heart attack, this man, this doctor I had judged and disrespected, he saved me, not just with the surgery, but with his kindness, his professionalism, his humanity. The daughter turned to the surgeon. Thank you, she said simply, but her voice carried the weight of years of pain and hope. Not just for saving his life, but for helping him see what I never could show him. The surgeon smiled gently. Sometimes life has its own way of teaching us what we need to learn, he replied. Your father's heart is healing well, in more ways than one. The driver squeezed his daughter's hand. I want to tell you about my plans, he said eagerly. About volunteering at your refugee center. He stopped as she gasped in surprise. Dad, are you serious? She asked, hardly daring to believe. You want to help at the center. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as he nodded. I want to make amends, he said firmly. For everything. All the years I wasted hating instead of helping, judging instead of understanding. He looked at the surgeon. "I learned that from you, doctor. You showed me what real strength is, not judging others, but helping them, even when they don't deserve it." The surgeon stood up, checking the monitors one last time. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said quietly. "The important thing is what we do with it." As he turned to leave, the driver's daughter stood up. "Doctor," she called out softly, "will you join us for coffee when Dad gets out of here? I'd love to hear more about your work, about what made you become a doctor." The surgeon paused at the door, touched by the invitation. "I'd like that," he replied with a warm smile. "Your father knows how to reach me." Walking away from the room, the surgeon could hear the sound of laughter. Father and daughter beginning to rebuild their relationship. It was a different kind of healing than what usually happened in the hospital, but just as important. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest miracles weren't the ones that happened in the operating room, but the ones that happened in the human heart. 3 months later, on a bright Sunday morning, a familiar yellow taxi pulled up outside the refugee center. The driver, now fully recovered, helped a young Syrian family load their bags into his cab. His daughter stood nearby, beaming with pride as she watched her father gently assist the mother with her small children. "The medical center first for your checkup," he said warmly to the family, "then we'll get you settled into your new apartment." His voice carried none of the prejudice it once held, only kindness and understanding. The children smiled shyly at him as they climbed into the backseat. This had become his new routine. 3 days a week, he volunteered at the refugee center, driving families to appointments, helping them move into new homes, or simply being there when they needed a ride. Each journey was a step further away from his old self. As he drove through the city streets, he caught sight of the hospital where everything had changed. The memories flooded back, not just of the surgery, but of the transformation that had begun that rainy night. He touched his chest absently, feeling the scar beneath his shirt. It had become a reminder not of pain, but of redemption. At a red light, he noticed a photo tucked into his dashboard, a picture from last week's coffee meeting with the surgeon. They had made it a monthly tradition, meeting to share stories and discuss life. His daughter usually joined them, and the three had formed an unlikely but wonderful friendship. The surgeon had become more than just the doctor who saved his life. He was now a mentor, a friend, and a living reminder of the power of compassion. Their conversations often stretched for hours as they discussed everything from medical advances to social justice, from family stories to hopes for the future. At the medical center, he helped the family out of his taxi, carrying their youngest child who had fallen asleep during the ride. Another taxi pulled up beside him, and he recognized the driver, one of his old colleagues who used to share his prejudiced views. "What are you doing with these people?" The other driver called out, his voice carrying the same bias he once had. Instead of anger, he felt sadness and compassion for his former friend. "I'm helping my neighbors," he replied simply, standing tall. "Come by the center sometime. Let me show you what I've learned." The other driver looked confused, but something in his former friend's peaceful expression made him pause. Inside the medical center, he was surprised to see the surgeon on duty. They greeted each other warmly, and the surgeon smiled at the family the driver had brought in. "I see you're keeping your promise," the surgeon said quietly. "Every day," the driver replied, watching as the medical staff welcomed the refugee family. "You know, that night in the taxi, I thought I was just picking up another fare. Instead, I was beginning a journey that would change my entire life." The surgeon patted his shoulder. "You did all the hard work yourself," he said. "You chose to change, to open your heart, to make amends. I just helped you stay alive long enough to do it." As he walked back to his taxi, the driver reflected on how much his life had transformed. His relationship with his daughter was stronger than ever. She had moved back to the city to be closer to him, and they spent every Sunday together, often volunteering side by side at the center. His taxi, once a space of judgment and prejudice, had become a vehicle of hope for families starting new lives. Each person he helped was a small step toward making amends for his past, and each smile he received was a gift he never thought he'd deserve. That evening, as he parked his taxi for the day, he noticed a young man trying to hail a cab in the rain. Without hesitation, he pulled over. The man looked surprised. Perhaps he'd been passed by other taxis before. The driver smiled warmly, unlocking the doors. "Where to?" he asked, his heart full of gratitude for his second chance at life, and for the lesson that had started with a similar scene on a rainy night, not so long ago.